person,
You're
but
the person?
yeah.
I like sugar, all right. I just changed it. I think we get going. Are we, you know, when we're. All right, this is the Oregon Board of Accountancy on Thursday, September 26, 2024 at 10:22 a.m. I am now reconvening the public session of the Oregon Board of Accountancy after conclusion of a recess that was called for the purpose of conducting executive session. So we'll go do another roll call real quick. Again, Joe Sullivan, Board Chair.
Rob Valdivia, Vice Chair. Jason Orm, LRC Chair.
Megan Harley, board member.
Jeremiah Leopard, Board Staff.
Tanya Moffett, BOAC Chair.
Amy Lyons, board member.
Logan Steele, Board Member.
This is Heather Vogelsong. She's just in the restroom. And she works for DOJ as well. Angie Hunt, Board Legal Counsel.
Art Baccioni, Executive Director.
Mike Mead, Managing Principal, CLA School of Office.
Marilyn Borner, board staff.
Andrew Barlow, Board Staff.
Sherry McPherson. I can't say my name. Sherry McPherson, CEO, OSCPA.
Adam Appenell, Vice Chair of OSCPA.
Perfect.
Tandy Thomas.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Danny. And then on Zoom, I'll call people as I see them on my screen. Rachel.
Rachel Reardon, PwC.
Yeah, thank you. And then Amanda, thanks for joining us. Amanda, can you hear us? Okay, well, I will just say Amanda Fells from the OAIA has joined us via Zoom. And then I think what we'll do as we go ahead and jump back into our agenda, we were going to start with the report from the OAIA, but I'll come back to that. That's item number 6. I'll come back to that in a minute in case she stepped away. So what we're going to do, because we have a guest, Tandy, we're going to go jump ahead to item number 9A, everybody, in our agenda, which is the license restoration request for Ms. Tandy Thomas. So I think everybody has kind of seen that before. And thank you again for sorry, I can't see you very well, but yeah, no, you're fine. I felt bad I couldn't see you, but thank you for joining us in person. I appreciate it. Yeah, and you know, we know in advance that you actually did pass the exam and did quite well on it in Arizona. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I think you knew before we had this in front of us in a prior board meeting a while ago. The rules have changed since then, so it allows us to kind of reconsider everything. And so we're happy to do that today. So at this point, is there kind of any questions or comments from the board?
Around anything you have in materials, questions for Tandy?
Okay, so at that point, then I would be looking for a motion, you know, to restore the CPA license for Tandy Thomas.
I move to restore the CPA license for Tandy Thomas.
I second. Perfect. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none. Abstentions? Hearing none. Motion passes. Congratulations.
Wow.
Yes, thank you for coming down.
It was worth it.
Yeah.
But thank you. But I guess my question would be is, what do I do? What's my next step?
Yeah.
Or
Actually, so first of all, there's a couple of steps here. So first of all, the license isn't free. There's still the usual fees that apply. My staff is very efficient at getting in touch with you around that front. There's still, we have a general requirement that is not waivable for us, that we have to make sure that there is a FND, what we call the initial licensure ethics exam, on record in the file. I don't know if you've done it already or not, but essentially if you haven't, that's no big deal. It's an easy thing. It's an easy thing to do. And staff can guide you to, there's a route via either OSCPA to get to that exam. It can also be done directly through AICPA. So essentially that's a very specific exam we have to have on record before we can issue. So those are the two things: money, that exam, or at minimum the two steps.
okay, so if I were to complete the ethics exam, and then put together I think there's a form or something to.
Yeah.
Basically reapply.
We still have to
Doesn't
give you like a
have
form that we have to send you. We have to do the usual attestations kind of stuff.
Well, I'm sure we'll be in touch.
So that part is, there's still a little bit of paperwork
Right.
around
I
this
assume
stuff,
so.
but basically it means that I can now say, okay, I don't have to have you worry about undergoing the supervised experience requirement and please come back in 2 years, kind of a thing, right? And that was really what we were trying to figure out, is the board willing to take a position on that now that we have the new rules and you, without us asking you to, but taking that pretty impressive step of getting through the CPA exam.
Yes, congratulations again, and thank you again for joining us, and you're welcome to stay if you wanna, you see a very.
I got an ethics exam.
Okay. It's a riveting meeting, but you're. Thank you. Yeah. All right, okay, we will go back, I'll just try to go back to item number 6. Amanda, are you available? Perfect.
Yes, I am. Hi, thank you.
Hi. Hey, Amanda, thanks for joining us. So we're just circling back to item number 6 in the agenda, the report of the OAIA.
Yes, thank you so much, and I apologize for being late to the meeting. So for OAIA, right now for us, it's in with CPE season. So we've got our biggest CPE classes coming up here. We have our business tax in depth at the end of October, and then we have some a couple of 2-day format 1040 classes, one in Eugene in November, and then one in December in Portland. And I know that so last year we offered a couple. We kind of trialed an 8-day format, which was 8 2-hour sessions. And I know that there was some requests to kind of follow up with that when we mentioned that last year to see how that went. We've decided not to continue that format this year. We found that it was just administratively burdensome for the amount of interest we were getting. You know, what the theory was, 8 2-hour sessions would be easier, on some for web classes than 2 8-hour sessions, and we just found that the amount of interest just didn't justify the extra headache behind it. So there's our follow-up with that, and yeah, that's kind of where our focus is at the moment. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Any questions, comments from the board? Not hearing any. Thanks again, Amanda. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Perfect. Let's go ahead. We'll jump now to item number 8, our board work session. So we'll go ahead with 8A1, which is our level set of work accomplished to date and what has changed. So kind of, either Martin, Angie, and Jason can kind of lead us through that discussion.
I'll kick us off. I'll keep it brief. Even though we had a special board meeting not much more than about a month and a half ago, there's a ton of stuff that's happened even just since then, primarily in the interplay between Angie and Legislative Council on us making the request after the board meeting saying, hey, can you please, start drafting this up? And then there's usually a lot of interplay. We've gotten, again, extremely lucky with Legislative Council being extremely accessible and collegial. We don't want to take you through all the back and forth. You have in your public materials essentially what came out of that work, which, and I want to be really clear because this is on the process side, right? There's this little kind of potentially not very meaningful words to you, but at the very top right corner, it says rough draft, Legislative Council. What does that mean? It means that Legislative Council gave us permission to produce this language publicly because that is what Legislative Council is putting into her oversight process inside the Office of Legislative Council before they produce a formal draft one. The formal draft one, we are expecting to get if I recall correctly, early next week or sometime in earlier October, right? And we need to provide a formal response. One of the things that I will simply say substantively, right? And this overlaps with item 2F, timing and process clarification, is that ideally, just from an efficiency standpoint, I would love it if the board can provide a clear message today, whether what you have in your materials is something that you endorse as is, because if it is, I would like to take this as an endorsement of this is the language that you like, because the only thing that should change in the formal first draft would be any technical edits made by legislative counsel around either naming, or numbering, or essentially legally required changes from their opinion, in their opinion, to essentially make this work. It shouldn't trigger any policy level changes whatsoever. So in an ideal world, just from an efficiency standpoint, is if the board can get on record about either saying, hey, we like this as is, or we like this as is, except for please don't do that, take that back out, then we can put that back into the process right away. And ideally, what I would love, especially since I'm on vacation after this board meeting for 2 weeks, I would love some form of delegated authority to the chair and to Angie to essentially respond to that formal draft, because we will have a very strict deadline of probably somewhere from 5 to 10 days to respond to that. It won't be conducive to calling another board meeting. If the chair sees something off and saying, hey, this is so different, we can figure that out then. But chances are 99.99% is that things are going to be just fine.
Yeah.
And I'd love to just keep the process going.
So don't worry, I won't write alternative practice structure rules with that authority.
Thanks.
That's one.
So what that
Everyone
means
laughs,
is,
but
so, in public session, we're not going to get into legal issues.
It's a joke from executive session.
Public session, we're not going to get into legal issues, but what we do need to cover are the kind of the broader context here. Because the broader context here is that this is very much part of a national discussion, and you have a number of items here under item 8A2 that essentially gave you all pretty solid hints as to the national picture, which basically is still, unfortunately, very much a counter image to what's happening in Oregon. In Oregon, we have an enormous amount of unity between the associations and the board around what it is that we would like to do. And at the national level, there is only some positives to report and other things where it's a little, it's getting actually more dicey rather than less, right? The good news is, if you look at the materials that you were provided with respect to the item under 2A, the exposure draft, right? What you could legitimately take from that exposure draft on the positive side is that when it comes to the licensure pathway portion of the national discussion, is that there is a little bit more consensus emerging and a little bit more of a move towards something that, at least for Oregon, a little bit unlike other jurisdictions, is actually a really good development because of kind of the shift to the focus in the NASPA proposed model more toward competencies, having some kind of a competency framework attached to and standards attached to the supervised experience. For us in Oregon, that's like, I almost want to say old news, because we have been embracing that concept for a very long time, right? And effectively, in that respect, the national discussion has moved closer to ours and has, I think, become a little bit more in that respect, at that conceptual level, emphasis conceptual level, a little bit more closer to a consensus. That's where the good news ends, because if you looked at the materials, you may have noticed that in effect, you have an exposure draft without an exposure draft. You have an exposure of slides that are PowerPoint slides describing what it is in more specificity than before. So that's progress around what NASBA is trying to do. But you have exactly 0 words in front of you in terms of actual language changes to the UAA. Now, why is that? Technically, the reason is that I think today at the AICPA level, there is a vote at the AICPA board around language. And tomorrow, the same thing is supposedly true for the NASBA board. The language that's getting considered on and voted on there was voted out of a UAA process that, quite frankly, tinkered on the precipice of failure. I think I can go as far in public session as say that there was a 10-9 vote at the UAA level, with essentially the AICPA members of the committee dissenting, and a courtesy vote by one AICPA member being provided to allow the language to be drafted. So why is that dissent occurring? That dissent is occurring because, quite frankly, there is enormous disagreement around how to structure mobility, and there is enormous hostility at the national level to this open mobility concept. Primarily coming from NASBA, which also explains why you got that legal opinion in those materials, right? And right now, there's also bluntly put direct split inside AICPA between the AICPA members of the UA committee and AICPA leadership. The leadership's position right now is thou must align with NASBA, and the UAA members of AICPA have said, we really don't like this language that's going to come our way. And we really can't do that. So there was essentially just enough done to at least get this language to an exposure draft stage. So I expect that at some point next week, probably no later than the end of next week, your emails will start populating with the actual language, right? From a strict process standpoint, that puts us as a board in a very awkward position, because I'll just be honest, just from a strict full information, please know what you're voting on, please know what you're discussing. I think it's a terrible idea for this board to comment on an exposure draft without seeing the underlying language. And I really feel incredibly uncomfortable having a substantive discussion with the board around what we should or shouldn't say to an exposure draft without having that piece of information in hand. Nor do I feel comfortable having some kind of a, Fata Morgana discussion of, well, I kind of can tell you about the language because I can kind of tell you what I think I saw, right? That's not a way to have a board discussion. You need to actually see the product that's coming out of there. I'm not gonna hide from you that from the stuff that I think is very likely to come out, that I shudder. But I will simply say there is nothing that I see at the national level that makes me discouraged about where we're going, right? It's unfortunate that NASBA is that dug in. We have problems both on the regulatory side in terms of essentially the level of listening that's going on and what is supposed to be a membership organization. If you look at this from a strict process standpoint, set any opinions aside for a minute about the substance of what was conveyed on the legal opinion side by NASBA. Okay, and just think about the process for a second, right? if indeed it was NASBA's purpose to help us all out by sharing information and sharing those legal opinions, right? You probably can find 1,000 other ways to do that than sending out in the public domain to all board members around the country and all executive directors around the country, that type of information. They have a NASBA listserv, they have access to all of our board councils. This could have been done differently. This was essentially NASBA's way of saying, we really don't like this whole open mobility piece. And they were willing to do it extremely publicly, including, I have confirmed this by now, there are 4 jurisdictions that are NASBA members that have had open mobility in place for decades. There was not a single heads up to those jurisdictions, not one, that there was this public blast going to come out of this maybe, you know, potentially an unconstitutional delegation of authority, right? So there is, it's not an easy place right now, just from a process and respect perspective, because this did not go down with my colleagues, because there could have been a very different way to handle sharing these concerns around that process. But we are where we are. I will say this, and I don't know if, it doesn't look like we still have, is Rachel still on? From TAC?
She was,
Okay. All right,
She dropped off, yeah.
she dropped off, okay. I will say this, is that I've had very close interactions with the Accounting Coalition, which for us, we're in PwC territory. They are, I think I can say publicly, very concerned about the status, the state of the national discussion. TAC has been very clear that they are very concerned about protecting mobility. They're very concerned about the language that's about to come out. I have asked them kind of like, how does their process work? Because even though I've done a ton of work with boards of, with accountancy on legislation, I've never done one with TAC directly at the table. I've asked them very directly how they work and when they take positions. And essentially the answer that I got is they don't like taking positions because it sometimes backfires on them. It's just, it's the big 4 throwing their weight around, kind of a feedback, right? However, they've been very clear with me that their clients are really worried about this and the retention of mobility. My feedback to TAC has been not making any asks, right? But what I will tell you is this, from a regulatory perspective, strict regulatory perspective, right? Mobility is not an issue of the big 4. Mobility is a public access to services issue, right? There is no policy difference that I can figure out between what the big 4 need versus what a regional accounting firm needs versus what a small CPA practitioner, and if Amanda were on the screen, that would be looking directly her, that would be sitting, just across the state line and, trying to practice across state lines, across multiple jurisdictions, in, having clients in multiple places, right? I don't think there is any policy difference there whatsoever. And even though as a regulatory board, our job is not to be in an advocacy position for any one of those firms, at the end of the day, we're in exactly the same place. Because if we do anything at all that makes it even worse than what it already is right now in terms of ability to deliver services, that's a worst case scenario, right? And that's quite frankly what I've conveyed back to my colleagues and to NASBA. I'm not alone in that, and I'm really, really struggling with where that conversation is going at a national level, because I do not see how it connects to either the interests of the profession or the interests of the public. It's a really, really hard place right now, and I think that we're in for some very difficult conversations, both on the AICPA side as well as on the NASBA side, because of that disconnect. It's a classic, I think, disconnect from the base and leadership type issue. And how that resolves, it will have to resolve in some way over the next few months. I don't know how it's going to resolve. But for us, ultimately the issue is, does it scare anybody here off the path that we're on? Right? That's essentially fundamentally the issue for us, right? But that's my most honest description, unfortunately, about where we're at in this national environment. I'm disappointed that I don't have better news on that front, but it's the only honest description that I can give to the board. So beyond that, I don't see TAC on here right now, but I think captured their feedback, hopefully accurately so far. I don't know if there's anything else that Sherry or Adam, you want to add from the AICPA side, if there's anything else that we didn't yet cover around this stuff?
You covered the whole environment very well. It's a problem on the AICPA side as well.
Yeah, it's rough out there.
States, numerous states across the country are concerned about all of this.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a work group tied through CPA SEA where we've been, not we, but committee members, not on behalf of CPA SEA, but they've been looking at open mobility too. I've been hearing from many of my colleagues.
mhm,
It's the elephant in the middle of the room that we need to move forward and get these things solved. But you set the
Yeah.
tone and stage on all of this
yeah.
very accurately.
Amanda, does it change anything on your end from OAI's perspective?
It doesn't. While ideally we would like to have a unified front, moving forward, the industry seems to be changing a lot more quickly than other powers may want it to, or be able to be reacting to it. And so, while ideally we would like to see kind of a unified front moving forward to protect this, knowing that OAIA, our primary focus is right to practice issues. And it seems like moving too slowly on these fronts or not being able to accommodate them could create right to practice issues for the small practitioners in Oregon. And so short of a national move forward, the progress that the board has been making so far in moving forward and maybe even coordinating with other states so that at least regionally we can protect this with, and protect this for our, local practitioners, I think is much appreciated. And so we really support the work that the board's been doing. So, thank you.
Right. So appreciate that clarification. So I think that gives the board kind of the fuller picture, kind of where we're at. Nationally, context-wise, for me, I just simply like to ask, can we just move straight to, in the interest also of keeping it moving, right? A discussion of, does anyone have a problem with what's in that draft right now that we would need to give back to Ledge Council and say, we're now, we don't like XYZ in this draft, or are we good with it as is? Because in that case, we can just essentially work through a delegated authority piece when the formal thing comes out that, Angie and Joe can handle this while I, sit on a beach at an undisclosed location with an undisclosed liquid. The HR would not want me to discuss that and not worry about what's happening here.
Probably good to do a vote to approve the draft.
Yeah,
I think the draft, and then do we need another vote on the delegated authority?
And the delegated authority would be really you, and I would just help. You.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I would be happy to handle any fun communication with NASBA.
yeah.
He's not gonna let you do that.
No, it would be really fun. I would be happy.
So I just had a clarification. So on the draft Ledge Council.
Yeah.
Am I right that the substantial equivalency is back in the definition for mobility? So is that I'm assuming that's on purpose, because that's the big difference between the draft that we saw before.
That is on purpose. So you're absolutely right. What you saw before came out of it's an excellent question. Thank you for bringing it up. what you saw is what left the LRC process and went to the board for blessing at the last board meeting, right? Which was our desired language that we put essentially, if you will, into the hopper for legislative council to chew on. And you're absolutely right that there was some chewing that occurred on that language. And essentially, we want to make sure you are absolutely, rock solid with respect to any challenges, is as far as I will say in public session, and say you're better off basing this on a substantial equivalency piece, except that if you look at what the substantial equivalency definition is, there's two things, actually potentially three things that I want to point out.
Yeah.
One is it's a very broad definition, which basically is a signal to not only are we contemplating these pathways, it basically means if another jurisdiction becomes more flexible and adopts these pathways, it says that is not going to be a problem for Oregon, right? So in that sense, there is a easy flow that is continued to be assured across state lines, right? The piece that you also don't see in there, there's two pieces you don't see in there that are just as important as what you do see in there. One, which is also where, quite frankly, the heart of the national dissent is at, is that there isn't a single piece of language in front of you that ties the substantial equivalency process to NASBA. It's a 10th Amendment issue. Every jurisdiction gets to define what substantial equivalency looks like. And it's a very clear message to the community that we do not endorse complicated constructs with complicated runarounds and complicated tie-ins, but something that can very clearly send a message to the profession that it's easy to do business here if you meet these basic criteria, both in terms of either getting a license or having practice privileges, right? It also, by the way, indirectly says, if there is a jurisdiction that decides to do what we called in the LRC, the lemonade stand test, right? That dances out of line and says, I now want to become a CPA after 6 months. We're going to give a CPA license after 6 months of selling lemonades, right? That actually wouldn't fly under this, which gets me to the last final piece. And this one is really important and we'll try to stay professional, okay? There is not any language that you see in here around the ability of the board to wholesale declare another jurisdiction as substantially equivalent. Essentially, what this language does is say, if you had a jurisdiction that dances out of line and somehow, starts awarding CPA credentials at, completely outside the framework that we've defined in substantial equivalency, essentially it gives us the ability, 3 times underlined, at the level of the individual to say, you know what, that's a public protection issue. You don't have practice privileges here, and we may not even be able to give you a reciprocity license here. But it is not a wholesale stopping of a whole jurisdiction. Because one of the problems, including with the current substantially framework, as NASBA would like to have it, to continue to propose, is this notion that if a jurisdiction does something that is considered out of line in terms of offering, a pathway that somebody doesn't consider substantially equivalent, is this notion of wholesale declaration of an entire jurisdiction is not substantially equivalent. What that in effect does, from my opinion, and I know you may cringe, okay, but what that in effect does from my perspective is you say to jurisdiction X that just went off the line, right, that because they licensed a single CPA in a pathway that you don't consider substantially equivalent, that all 15,000 CPAs in that jurisdiction that were no threat to the public until yesterday suddenly became a threat to the public today. And yet you are going to take their private property rights to their license, their practice privileges, and essentially start restricting those rights based on no conduct by those licensees, no changes to those licensees, right? Based on conduct by the board to license somebody else. And I can't wrap my head around it. From an ethical perspective, from a moral perspective, and I'm not a lawyer, cannot give legal advice, but it screams legal problematics to me to the highest degree in terms of fairness, due process, private property rights violations. Again, not legal advice, but it just, the whole thing just screams at me at all levels, right? So I'm super proud of the fact that there isn't a single word in this concept that would permit us to join the club that would like to declare jurisdictions wholesale and CPAs wholesale and condemn them based on pathway decisions. That just makes no sense to me, especially when we're talking about workforce pipeline issues, is somehow going wholesale after CPAs that have done nothing wrong. It just doesn't make any sense, not just from an advocacy perspective, but from a public protection perspective. It just doesn't. So anyway, I'm glad you asked the question because it gave me a chance to box and I scared Joe.
That's helpful, and especially just pointing to the definition, this new definition of substantially equivalent that's in this draft. I guess my only follow-up question there is like, did the board consider, or should the board consider even maximum flexibility in that definition of substantially equivalent? I see it's now got the three pathways that we're going to put into our initial licensure law, but it, like, sort of following the Washington example, would the board consider, or should the board consider it being substantially equivalent means, you know, a license granted from another state whose licensing requirements are substantially equivalent as determined by the board by rule, you know, and leave the discretion to the board to do that. I just think of like, you know, we've heard so many proposals over the last 6 months from so many different states about what they might do. And I think these capture the main three that are the sort of even consensus, but that doesn't mean that California might not do something different or have a pathway that doesn't fit in one of these buckets. And I mean, at least from my perspective, and I don't necessarily speak on behalf of the whole OSCPA board here, but I was part of this discussion and we were highly supportive of the concept of open mobility. So I don't think that we would be, you know, I don't think there'd be any difference between that and supporting a concept like this, or even going as far as saying that the board can just define that with its rulemaking authority. And it's just a thought, given the things we've talked about with how cumbersome Oregon's legislative processes and getting these things changed. I think it maybe behooves us to think ahead a little.
This is just so I don't forget, and it's not criticism, on bottom of page 3, item 19, northern is not spelled correctly.
Oh, yeah, there is some, I tried to clean up the spelling errors, which was, you know, this was essentially an internal document that I was allowed to publish. I cleaned up the spelling errors and I didn't catch all of them, so.
Okay, no problem, sorry.
Ledge Council has been fantastic. Spelling was not her strength.
Well, they moved really.
Yeah.
And it hasn't gone through her editing people yet, so.
Yeah, exactly. The editing people catch all that, but I wanted to give you guys a somewhat cleaned up product.
Let's,
Quite, catch that.
Kinda, I think just to make sure we're all on the same page here, I think you got through everything in item 2, right?
I
And then,
think so, except for that we need a motion still, right?
well, there's no motions in 2, right? I think that goes to item 3.
I think that goes to item.
Sorry,
Where am
we're
I?
8.
Oh, yes,
8.
sorry, that
Sorry, I
goes
was
to
saying
item 8. Yeah, that's right. That's item A3 on the next page. Sorry, I'm on page, yes. Approved language with or without edit, so we're on 3B
Yeah, 8.
right
Yeah.
now.
8, yeah.
8. sub 3, sub.
Yes. Yes, 8.3B is where we're at now, correct?
Yes, and.
Yeah, that was a lot we covered. So essentially where we're at is, we'd be looking for motions to, approve the language with or without any edits, just based on the discussion, comments from the OSCPA. So at this point, I'd be looking for any further discussion from the board or emotion. Or awkward sounds.
I'm thinking about, Town's comments. And I'm not, I think our 3 pathways are what I would be most comfortable with. In other words, I'm trying to think about how we incorporate, I'm back, it's the lemonade thing, right? So it's like, all right, do we run that risk of some other state going wildly rogue? And then it's like, okay, y'all can come in, it's fine. By opening it up more.
Could I clarify a little? I guess
Yeah.
to clarify, like, my thought wasn't to actually change the content of it, or to leave only in statute that the board has authority to define substantial equivalency, and that the board would adopt a rule that is essentially that same language in it right now, but have more flexibility to change that rule through the rulemaking process in the future.
Yeah.
If there were additional pathways that become, within the board's judgment are appropriate for licensees that other jurisdictions are doing. So I don't think it necessarily.
Yeah,
has
no,
a
that
risk
makes,
there. It's more
thank you
just,
for clarifying that.
again, flexibility.
And I think that makes a ton of sense from the standpoint of, we're gonna put something in that's gonna go in to the 25 legislative session. And then if we're like, oh, gosh, we really misunderstood what Nevada was gonna do, then we've got 2029 or whatever to do it again, to change it again. Like, can we pull the definition out?
It's a fine line. It's a fine line. I don't think
Okay.
it's super, I mean,
No,
it's safer to put it in the statute than
Okay.
it is to pull it out.
All right,
Um,
I love the flexibility there, yeah, so, all right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree.
Mhm.
I like the least amount of detail possible in statutes, because anything that creates a legislative change is like pulling teeth.
Okay.
It's brutal.
Sorry, can I ask one more question? Sorry.
Yes, yes. I know.
I have monopolized the time, but so I'm just wondering, like, and this is more to Andy, but is there, like, if it had the 3 definitions and then said, or as otherwise defined in board by, is there distinguishment there, or is that the same kind of concern?
So, I mean, this is legislative council made the change. I can, I think it was in there before, kind of in that way, where we had sort of more rulemaking authority on it. I think there's a couple of things that come up, different issues that could come up with having it that route. I think that you're more, you guys can propose that change in the process. But I think from the board's safest path is this way.
Okay, so maybe it's something that you saying, you guys, like the OCPA, through our legislative council or our lobbyists, we could try to, maybe propose some additional.
But by what safest path, what do you mean? What's the risk?
Well, there's, the whole issue of whether or not it's too broad, whether or not it would be found to be, a delegation issue, or there's all the stuff that's sort of surrounding issues that are coming up with rulemaking authority for boards and overstepping the statutory constructs that are given to boards. Sort of all those areas.
Terms almost up, by the way. So, just putting that, but, be really safe, or do we wanna be a little more unsafe and provide more flexibility?
I mean, what's the real risk from a safety standpoint?
That's what I was getting at.
Like, are we really gonna like have somebody be like, I'm gonna sue you? I just, for,
I think we,
for allowing me to become a CPA in your state?
so that wouldn't be the person, you know, that would probably sue you.
Person harmed by the person we.
The person harmed by it?
Or,
The
you
human?
know, somebody else coming in and saying it's an unconstitutional delegation.
And you think that is the most bizarre concept, that they would actually be opposed to that, because what on earth are they doing? Right?
Yeah, I mean,
At that point, you're saying, like, you're more interested in your interest than the interest of your members and the interest of the actual profession. Right?
Or that we're harming the public by allowing
Right.
willy-nilly anybody to come and practice.
So going back to Haley's point, I'm like, well, do I really care? I don't.
I mean, I think there is a way you could, there is a way you could draft. I mean, like
So,
I mean, I can take it back to appellate and try and get a more like, sort of like.
I mean, I know what you're doing, and I like it because it gives us a path to get it done.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So I appreciate that.
I don't think it hurts for us to ask, right? Because if, right now, if what you do is basically ask ledge council and appellate saying, hey, the board would like to have a little bit more flexibility, that we could potentially
Yeah.
tag something on by rule.
Yeah.
Is there a pathway for us to do that? We
Yeah,
just
or
ask the
like,
question.
can we ask
Worst
it?
thing that happens is that they say, you know, we're really not comfortable with that we can't defend it. Or they say, well, you know, if the board really wants it, maybe there is this, right? So if we go on the record and say, yeah, in an ideal world, we'd like to have more flexibility and manage that risk, right? Then we can ask you to make that request, approve the language, make the request. And then if it turns out that they give us something, then you will see it.
As long as it's not holding us up from accomplishing something.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the time to do it.
Okay, and I think we should ask. Is everyone okay with that? Because I want as much flexibility in the statutes as we possibly get.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth an ask.
Yeah.
I would much rather ask and be told not a good idea than to get
Yeah.
into the legislature
Yes.
and appear to be unprepared.
Yes.
Or that we're
100% of the
making-
shots you don't take.
Or
And
that
Jerry,
we're
could
making
taking that on.
edit, which means it could be perceived as not supported.
Okay.
And just for clarity, since you're gonna follow up with ledge council anyway, does that mean that I don't have to write her separately saying that the board approved the language as rough in the rough draft form for LC 599 and so?
I don't think we want to tell her that 100%.
Okay. Okay. My desire for transparency sometimes gets the better for me.
Well, only because then if I come back to her and say, then.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She's gonna contradict her.
yes.
Got it. Yeah, no,
And I don't think she really cares until she gets it back.
yeah.
That it's,
Perfect.
because she's not gonna
All right.
change anything right now
Okay.
anyways.
So
Nice.
would everyone be on board with that? Does that make sense? I mean, so I think then we'd be looking for a motion to approve the language as presented with an edit to ask for the additional flexibility as discussed. Would that be clear enough?
Yes.
So moved.
Right, second?
Perfect. We have a motion. We have a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none. Abstentions? Hearing none. Motion passes. All right, thank you. Appreciate the question. Perfect. I think then the next piece would then just be the potential delegation to me along with Angie's help. So while Martin is on some well-deserved vacation.
Move to delegate authority to Joe with Andrew's assistance while Martin is on vacation for a period of time.
Yeah, in October. I believe.
In October,
To respond to the draft.
to respond to the draft.
A second? Did I hear-
Second.
Okay, thank you. Motion, here a second. Discussion. Hearing none. Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, those opposed? Hearing none, abstentions, I don't know if I should abstain from that, I did vote yes, but hearing none, motion passes.
Martin, do you go from vacation to the annual meeting?
No, I'll be back here. I'll be back here way before then. Have some fun. I'll cover that later.
All right,
Do you mind if I just very quickly get through the exposure draft piece?
please do.
So, folks, I talked about this a little bit in my earlier description around where we're at nationally and my distinct lack of desire to put the board in a position to have us start commenting on exposure draft before seeing actual physical language. I know that it probably likely makes sense for you, that request, but I also feel bad because the timing issues are such that it basically means that the way the process is designed with deadlines is that I don't have the option of simply saying, hey, let's look at this language at our next regular board meeting and then respond, because the response deadline will be gone. Right? But I would like to first of all test out the waters and say, is the board okay with my concerns? Because I really don't like responding to this without seeing the actual language. Right? But it also means that we would have to pay a price and take away one of your lunches at some point. And schedule one of our infamous, highly efficient Joe run, let's tackle this baby over one of our lunches and figure out what we want to do kind of a things. Are you generally on board with kind of two-stepping it that way, even though it's a little bit more work for us? Because I really hate putting us through it without having language in hand, and I have, in all honesty, trust issues. Because we've seen before, unfortunately, with NASPA on what happens when we respond to slides. Last time we did that and we responded with, you may recall in February, we told them, oh yeah, please keep on discussing because that was the question, right? But by the way, we're concerned about all these things. By the time we came to a conference 2 months later, everybody that had agreed to continue the discussion was described as, oh, you have now agreed to everything. And it was like, no, that's not actually what happened here. So I'm super nervous just from that trust perspective that us responding based on what we think is on a PowerPoint slide without seeing the language is a really bad idea.
Can I ask one clarifying question about the draft that is important to me, the competency-based experience pathway?
Yes.
Is that that's a year and then another year of experience? Or is that just a total 1 year of experience?
It's a really great question. I will be honest and say the answer to your question should be a simple yes, right? Because and I think it traces back to this position that NASPA is putting themselves in, where on the one hand side, from my perspective, doing the right thing of saying, we really would like the profession to step up and have some standards around what supervised experience should look like. But their approach right now still is now in an awkward position because they're saying, we're only going to require that at the BA level and for only 1 out of the 2 years. So they're essentially putting themselves into a position that I have a hard time wrapping my head around, that if you are in favor of standards for supervised experience, why they should only apply in one option for only 1 out of the 2 years, right? That's a little bit, I have a hard time with it because it's harder to explain that intellectually than essentially what we've done in Oregon all the time, which is if you have a supervised experience requirement, you have standards around it, which is quite frankly also what happens in other regulated professions, is that you have supervised experience requirements toward licensure with standards around it. So it's awkward, it reads concerning, because I think that's where your question comes from, because I actually did a double take myself. Looking at their language, I'm like, this suddenly reads like a bachelor's +1 rather than a bachelor's +2. I don't think that's what it means, even though it kind of suggests it, but you're right on the money, because I did a double take too. when I saw, when I saw that language, because it's like, that's not what they've been talking about. They've been talking about, they have been through so many, nomenclature changes in terms of the way they describe it, but for a long time, they described it as a 120 plus 1 plus 1, right? Which basically meant, okay, we're willing to essentially consider substantial equivalent if you now have 120 semester hours plus 1 year of the, if you will, structured supervised experience. And I'm trying to use their vocabulary, and I think what they would then call general experience of another year, which essentially from a regulatory perspective, I would call a little bit more bluntly experience without any standards attached to it, right? So I think you're right that the language is super confusing. The only reason I didn't bring it up is because until the language comes out, I refuse to believe that they actually went to a 120 plus 1. I think it might have been a little bit more of an accidental kind of a representation here on the slides that creates that impression. I don't believe that's what's actually going on. I could be wrong by the time the language comes out, but I think I would have heard if they had made that huge of a shift, because that's a significant deal. If you go to 150 plus 1 and then a 120 plus 1, it's like, where's the trade-off here? Or maybe, I don't know. So good point.
We will see.
Yeah. So can we schedule something, or do we do that later?
Yeah, if everyone has access to their calendars, I think we can, and if everyone's willing to do that, I think that's an efficient way to do it again. And I'm thankful that everyone has been willing to do that the past couple of years. It's been a good way to keep things moving since we only meet a handful of times a year. So if you're willing to continue doing that, I think it's really helpful.
When do we think the language will be out?
It's supposed to come out, the vote, as I understand it, the final votes at the directors levels are occurring today and tomorrow, today AICPA, tomorrow NASBA. So it's just an issue of then pushing it out. So I'm hoping by the end of next week, early October, no later than mid-October. Because remember, they've kind of given us a December 6th deadline to respond. And so we need to have some time to chew on this stuff. I'm kind of thinking, and I don't know what folks think here, that it might be helpful to not just have the language, but maybe also some input and clarification that might come out of the annual meeting before we sit down and do this, although I'm not sure how helpful the annual meeting will be. But that would mean doing it in early November, because the conference is over on the 30th of October.
Okay.
Right.
What about? I guess we have that. I was gonna say
we have
November 8th, but we're already doing
we're doing the town hall there, which
yeah.
So
what if we did November 6th? That Wednesday.
Yeah, that will work.
Thumbs up.
This is Zoom over lunch hour.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay.
But that's perfect, because that also gives me that enough time afterwards to craft stuff. And
Okay, so I think that was easy.
awesome.
Wow. All right.
What a group.
Yeah, okay, so just hold that on your calendars, Wednesday, November 6th at noon for a very efficient 1-hour board meeting. Okay. Right. We don't need a motion or anything for that, right? Just adding.
Nope.
That will just be sent out at a later date. All right, let's keep moving. Now we're on 8B, discussion of current options related to alternative. I think we can actually be really efficient here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll start with one. Martin, do you kind of want to walk
just-
through this. I know that,
Just for the record, in public session, I simply want to point out that the board has materials in front of a number of instances of both very large and smaller accounting firms moving toward APS, alternative practice structures, and essentially the policy question is for the board that is present right now is how do we want to respond to those developments, given the way our current the current structure and the current structure of our current laws and rules is, and what we may want to do with potential changes. So if I may, just for the sake of super efficiency and speed,
sounds right.
what I would like to recommend is that the current message back, if asked, is we're working on a risk policy response, not pinning us down in terms of where the board may land, that it will not get current responses, do not go beyond the board is working on figuring out a way to adapt to the current developments in the profession, and that further work will take place based on recommendations coming out of the Laws and Rules Committee process and further consideration at the board meeting in December.
It would make sense to do a vote to send it to the LRC for review.
Yes. So let me ask then two questions. One is that an okay summary? If this recommendation is okay, is that essentially, does that capture essentially, is that an okay message to send out when we are kind of confronted by this? And two, is there, a motion on referring the developing policy options development to the Laws and Rules Committee that is eagerly awaiting such direction?
Is that sufficient guidance?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So is there a motion here?
So moved.
Okay,
I second.
okay. We have a motion. We have a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
All right.
Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none. Abstentions? Hearing none. All right, thank you, everyone. I think that covers.
Yeah. Mr.
Really, yeah,
I
B
may-
1, 2, and 3 essentially, right?
Yeah, if I may ask for a little bit of agenda flexibility, because I have been not just randomly texting on my phone, but
I mean, you're
doing board
kind of
business. I'm in touch with Dr. Elizabeth Almer
Mhm.
around the next item. She should be available in about 10 to 15 minutes. So if we can grab a couple of items, she's stepping out of a retreat type thing that she's doing now. If we can grab a couple of items from the maybe new business to kind of keep us moving until she's available. I should be able to get her on by about 11:35, 11:40.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, let's just jump right in to 9. We already did 9A. Let's go to 9B, our updated debt collection policy.
Yes. So first of all, I want to apologize to the board that there was a little bit of a miscue in my own team here. You have, for those of you that eagerly and immediately, and you don't need to say who you are, opened up the emails on late Friday and immediately started reading the board materials, you essentially got a slightly incorrect version of the debt policy, those materials, because I thought that this was the one ready for prime time. There was another one uploaded to your materials late yesterday. That is essentially the same thing. If you read the Friday version, it's the same thing except for, and Angie helped me with this, except for I think there were 2 things that were edited in the other version.
I took out the fees portion. Because
There was a fee portion that was taken out, and there was one other
And then
thing.
just that how the board is adopting it. that we're officially, that it's not just sort of, we're approving the policy, we are adopting the policy, just language around that,
Okay.
to making it more clear that this is what the board is taking on.
All right, so part one here is, I wanted to make sure that there is clarity on why it is that some of you may be looking at a slightly different version, but there's no evil, let's slide something through here going on. I do want to, because I suspect that actually very few board members were here. I don't think this is just a new issue for Megan. I actually suspect that very few folks were on this board when we originally worked our way through this issue, which was also, I think, before my time. This was during the time when I was not with the board. So I want to just kind of set a little bit of context here for what it is you're actually looking at. Okay. What you're looking at is essentially a requirement that all state agencies are supposed to have in place with respect to a properly updated debt collection policy. Now, why is that? If you kind of zoom that out at the 40,000 foot level, right? About 12 years ago, there was kind of a pretty significant, let's just say, very heavy discussion in the legislature, a very unhappy discussion, because at a time when the state was in significant financial distress, had a very difficult budget cycle, you know, suddenly kind of the news blew up that the state had, I think it was like $4 billion in uncollected debts. And there were a lot of questions raised about why, there was a lot of frustration around, and a very bipartisan frustration, I might add, around, hey, we should be, this is money that should be available for us to fund services, or frustration around why are we so inefficient at not collecting these debts that are owed to the state of Oregon, right? So it caused a policy wave that came that basically said, what do we need to do to get this in line, right? And effectively what they figured out is that because Oregon is a very, from its organizational structure, an extremely decentralized, if you look at the executive branch organization chart, it's an extremely decentralized arrangement. We have so many state agencies that even the governor's office and the secretary of state have a difficult time figuring out where all of our state agencies are and how many we can have, because we're that decentralized, right? So what that meant was, in a debt collection process, what they found, unsurprisingly, is that most state agencies didn't see that as their expertise, and the success rate and the way to approach the stuff varied widely. I think the most diplomatic way that I would phrase it, right? So the legislature said, we're done with all of this, right? We are giving one unit in state government, the Oregon Department of Revenue. They created something called OAA, Other Agency Accounts unit inside the Department of Revenue, and saying, thou must now essentially any debts that are legally owed to any state agency, regardless of who this agency is, why it exists, what its mission is, actual debt collection needs to go to experts that know what they're doing, and they're doing it on behalf of state agencies. They get to recoup their costs kind of off the top, they get to charge certain fees for the work that they do, but you now must send this stuff over. Effectively, the policy that you're looking at is an attempt to update the framework of when we send something over to OAA, what are the steps that we need to comply with before we send something over to OAA, and to align that at the same time with not just the statutory framework that requires us, like all other state agencies, to send our debt collections over to the Department of Revenue, but also to align it with the requirements in something very beautiful that CPAs especially like. It's called the Oregon Accounting Manual, otherwise OAM, right? That we as state agencies have to follow in terms of our processes and procedures. And what you really have in front of you is work by a brand new counsel who was hired into a unit of DOJ that has this essentially as its specialty. So this isn't just coming from Angie, who suddenly acquired debt collection expertise, but there's a colleague of hers named Justin Leonard, who essentially is the new expert inside DOJ, who essentially took on the work of saying, I'm going to look at the most current statutory framework of your requirements, and I'm going to look at the most recent version of the Oregon Accounting Manual, and I'm going to update your policy looking at both. So this is effectively a two-step. One is that work, updating our policy, is now in front of you with a request to approve it. The second piece is, once it's approved, one of the items that's a to-do list item that's been hanging over our heads, and Jeremiah, please correct me if I say this somewhat incorrectly, is we have had with all the staff upheavals that we've been through and rebuilding, we just haven't done what we should have done with this board for a much more regular period of time, which is essentially bring something to you call on a rotating regular basis called write-offs, right? Of where debt becomes uncollectible. And there's certain processes we have to go through with you in order to write off debt, right? We haven't been able to do that, but we're now gearing up to do that. And in order to do it right, the first step was, can we make sure that we have our policy under which we would bring it to you updated? Step one, right? And then the goal is, if you approve that policy, that no earlier than the December meeting of the board, and if that's not feasible, no later than the February meeting of the board. But my goal initial will be the December meeting of the board, that we could actually bring you a bunch of specific requests under that policy so that we can kind of catch up with our kind of the financial side of our obligations of saying, this is how we're doing in terms of stuff getting collected on our behalf. Here is stuff that meets the criteria where it makes sense to ask you to actually write off the remainder of a debt, right? And do it under this newly approved policy. So that's kind of the way all of this stuff connects to today. And hopefully, if things go well, to an item that you'll see on the December board meeting agenda. Does that make sense? Hopefully, questions around that?
So as an action step, then we'd be looking for an adoption.
Yes.
Is that the right term?
Yeah, your motion to approve, it's fine.
Okay,
The language
alright.
is in the document. That's the language, like it actually says you're adopting. It has the
Okay, I
actual
was
language in
making
it.
sure it said that right. So we'd be looking to approve the debt collection policy as presented. So moved, anybody here?
So moved.
Thank you.
I thought we were still waiting for them to say, yes, that's what we're waiting to, that's what we're.
Yeah.
You're good.
All right, I heard a motion. Do I have a second?
I second.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none. Abstentions? Hearing none. Motion passes.
All
All
right,
right,
Mr. Chair, I think I saw Dr. Ulmer joining
yes,
us. If you're okay stopping and reverting back to work session item 8C.
yes, I saw that as well. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ulmer, and stepping out of your retreat. So appreciate you taking the time.
Good morning. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you
I'm
great.
sitting in a very awkward little corner of the University Place Hotel, so I wasn't sure how this would work. Thank you for the opportunity for me to speak. Martin, have you prepped them? They've all received the spreadsheet, right?
The spreadsheet was sent out and uploaded yesterday, and Andrew, at my request, is now screen sharing.
Okay.
So
Thank you, Andrew.
unfortunately, your picture is now much smaller, but in
That's okay.
exchange, there is now we're working on changing the size of it so that it becomes a little bit more readable. I don't know if we can make it a little bit larger on the screen.
I'm
Andrew.
fine. I wasn't anticipating going through the spreadsheets in much detail. So let me just explain the purpose of why I was asked to come here today. So I chair the pipeline committee, which is charged with providing some information and facilitating the process for the granting of the, we're calling it $1 million now. I recognize that number may change slightly, to the Oregon Society of CPAs, with the express purpose of encouraging and supporting more students to accounting careers, hopefully ultimately to become CPAs in the state of Oregon. So this committee has been working really diligently, and we got to the point now where part of what we felt would be helpful is to provide some information to the board that would help inform your decisions in how you guide us further. So what I want to do first, before we actually look at this whole spreadsheet, Andrew, can you just flip to the first tab on the left, which is assumptions and determinations to be made by the board, school assumptions. Perfect. So as just, again, a little bit more background, we were trying to just put some numbers to the back of a napkin. And this is, of course, because we're accountants, our back of a napkin is a lovely spreadsheet. And what we were starting with is trying to understand the number of students who might be eligible for these grants, given that the guidance we were provided is that these should help diversify the pipeline of accountants in Oregon. And the most objective measure that we could do without running really afoul of sort of current environment and court cases is to look at financial need. So what I did is I gathered up, just as a starting point for us, gathered the number of students, and you can see the two columns that are most relevant are those highlighted in gray. The estimated eligible students, meaning Pell Grant eligible by each of the major universities and PCC. We just, again, back of the napkin, Tana Hollis at the OSCPA and I thought that somewhere between 15% to 20% of eligible students may apply. It's a shockingly low number sometimes who apply for scholarships. These are time-stressed students, and often, by the way, students who may not feel all that deserving of a scholarship. So we just kind of came up with some numbers because we felt that that was really important for the board to see what we thought these numbers might be when they're assessing how ultimately they would like us to provide some language in the contract with the OSCPA about how much money, how much of these funds would be spent initially and or endowed. So providing scholarships into perpetuity. I went ahead and I just put some assumptions down that we have been working off of from our conversations on the committee. So these are financial need eligible students, easiest measured by Pell Grant, but there are some other ways we can solicit that information from students. Students need to have some kind of a minimum GPA requirement. Again, this is my understanding was the board wanted this to be more of a needs-based scholarship as opposed to just pure academic merit. So I've put some things in there for the board to consider in terms of what we've been discussing. What is kind of the minimum GPA, realizing that typical scholarships are usually something on a 4-point scale of 3.5, 3.7 or better. So we're looking at what is sort of the population that we're looking at here. Our potential way of thinking about this is a student who gets a B- or better, which would be a 2 on their accounting courses. 2.7 would be could potentially be a reasonable number. It could be a B. Oh, and there's a typo there. It should have said 3.0. Excuse me. That was my typo in here. As I said, decision to endow or not endow, that is at the discretion of the board. We made assumptions of endowments are typically 4 to 6% annual payouts. That's based on what the OSCPA does and my knowledge of what PSU does. Any unused funds in a given year, and any interest income, we would roll forward. And so based on that, Scott Wright, Claire Costin from UP and I came up with, Scott built the spreadsheet that you're provided with our input. And we wanted to provide as simply potential models. I want to reiterate that there are many other scenarios that could roll out here, but we were just trying to show a small sample that would capture the scope and reach of what $1 million of funding could do. So again, none of these are suggested by the committee. I'm presenting them to you for consideration. You all are very familiar with spreadsheets. You could play around with them if you want to see what some other scenarios would do. And with that, I'm going to stop and see if there's questions before we look at a couple of these. Okay, one other thing, and feel free to interrupt me. It's hard for me to see everybody on my tiny laptop and the tiny little picture of you all in the room. Amanda, I can see beautifully. So please feel free to interrupt. You're as big as you're as big as the whole conference room there. The other thing that we had a conversation about is that we wanted to raise the issue of whether the board felt this should be a one and done. You get a scholarship and then, maybe you get one the next year, maybe you don't. And there was some input from Cynthia Killingsworth, who is faculty at PCC and has been there a very long time and is very, very, just has incredible depth of knowledge. And she commented that a lot of what, and this is my point number 3, that this idea of equitable access, if we're trying to provide equitable access to the profession, a lot of what they do at PCC is talking about supporting students start to finish. And so that was something that we also built into our spreadsheets. And these are oversimplified, but it's simply to get an idea. Should we look at a couple, just like 2 of them, one with, one without an endowment, to give everyone an idea of what we're talking about here?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right. So and again, when we were doing this, we were, just running some different scenarios. How many scholarships? How much would be funding? And a big piece of this decision that we need from the board is understanding how much you want pushed out quickly, how many students you want to receive the funding, or when I say quickly, versus do you want this to be something that goes on to perpetuity? And so there are a number of scenarios with no endowment. And I want to be clear, we're not recommending no endowment, but we did more scenarios that way, largely because Martin had conveyed that he felt there was a desire from the board to try to make an impact as quickly as possible. And remember, this doesn't hit students' financial their accounts at their universities until 2026, till fall 2026. So quickly is a relative term. So year 1 is 26, 27, and so forth. Yes, we all love government. So, so this first scenario, and again, keeping in mind that, again, really rough numbers. We're thinking maybe we have 80 to 100 applicants. We really don't know. But this is we had to start somewhere. So that's what that first tab was intended to do, was to show you what that looked like. So if we said, we think we're going to have 80 scholarships to give, that would allow us $2,500 per student over their entire education through the 5th year. Scott, Claire, and I had some conversation around that, and that's what you can see, somebody who gets it just for their MAC. That's your cohort 1. Cohort 2 is somebody who gets their first scholarship as a senior, then they're going to get 2 years worth of scholarships. And the OSCPA can work that in about for example, preference being given to students who'd received a previous scholarship subject to maintaining academic standards. It would not be, my expectation is this would not be given as a multi-year scholarship. It would be given as single year scholarships with a fast pass, if you will, the Disney fast pass to future years if you continue to pursue accounting and so forth. Realizing though, back to this MAC, we realize not everybody's going to pursue a MAC, and we decided to just leave that in there, realizing some students will drop off. And then if a student doesn't pursue a MAC, that allows another student to pop in, maybe who is a MAC student coming back from Washington or coming back from California. So it allows some turnover of who those students are. So that's a little bit of a simplification. But what you can see is all the funds would be expended by year 6 if we took that approach. But year 6 is 2032.
gonna make one observation, and it is self-serving, so.
Sure, go ahead, Logan.
Is the focusing on Mac versus Mac or fifth year or just fifth year? It seems
Yes,
like
it
kind
is
of a-
just fifth year. It is not
Okay.
intended to be, that was Scott. Scott's U of O centric. We know that. That's
Okay.
where he comes from. So he's thinking that. I almost changed it, and honestly, this has been such a crazy week. I'm like, I can explain that here. Thank you for asking that question. So yes, it would also be PSU's MTAX being self-serving.
Self-serving there, right?
Is that fifth year just for exam eligibility? So not like an MST or something?
No, it would include the MST. It could include somebody coming in for their post-bac. I think that I probably should have taken the time to do a control replace on that and just said fifth year. So it is any sort of fifth year, but recognizing with all of the changes we're talking about on licensure, we may have dramatic declines in the number of students seeking a fifth year, in which case this model is not perfect. And certainly other models could be you could easily adjust this model to see what it would do. We were, again, just trying to present an array of options in support of the board, so that the board doesn't need to build the spreadsheets and make the assumptions. We're the ones that sort of had the assumptions underlying what we thought was likely to occur. If there's not, so let's just flip over to the next one, the $43,000 scholarships. You can see if you cut the number, I mean, no surprise, you cut the number, even if you increase the dollar amount, we're going to spread it out over 10 years. The two that I'd really like to look at, could we look at the 30 at 5,000? That again, I think that one way of looking at that too is there could have been more at 5,000 easily instead of the 30. I mean, you could do 50, or, you know, thinking about how many people are you trying to get into the profession? If the real desire of the board is to get as many people in as quickly as possible, then you scale up the number, you scale of scholarships, you scale up the dollar amount, and you don't do an endowment. If the desire is to create a sustainable pipeline, then there needs to be an endowment piece in there. So, like I said, you know, we just put a few samples together and really did this because we need more guidance from the board on how they would like us to move forward, how you all would like us to move forward. And then let's scooch over. Can we go all the way over to the one that has an endowment? There you go. So we had a lot of conversations on the board until I will credit Claire for saying, look, I'm just doing some calculations. And when you do an endowment, boy, does that radically change this. So we are at your service to, you know, support this in whatever way the board sees fit. And this is a really important juncture that we need guidance on. I think the first question is endowment, no endowment. The second question is, where do you want the bulk of the impact? How many years do you want the bulk of the impact to occur? And when we have that, then we can back into some probably, you know, better projections, but they're always just going to be pretty rough because we don't know how many applicants we'll get.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, as you think about your substantive responses and kind of where you land on this, I want to just explain very briefly why we're having this discussion now, to just make a timeline clarification, right? Because effectively what's happening is this stuff is sitting inside our, both in our legislative piece and inside the budget process. There is a deadline there is an effective date of July 1. And effectively what we know is, without getting into a lot of detail, that we really need to have things in place contractually and with final contracts approved at both in the private sector as well as on our end, no later than actually exactly a year from now. No later than the September board meeting of next year is when we need to be completely done with this development process at the stage of approval. So the reason this is coming to you now is because in essence, we're trying to use the time while all of this is in the legislative and budgetary process to use the committee to essentially work on developing the underlying contractual framework, because we want to make sure we get it right. We have the right time to do it. We have enough time to do it. and that it's all ready to go when we need it to be ready to go. So that's kind of the timeline context behind all of this.
And we do not, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are not going to be putting anything into the contract with the OSCPA that stipulates the dollar amount of the scholarships or the number. Am I correct, Martin?
I wouldn't go quite that far. I mean, it's quite frankly, it's whatever we want to put on the table,
Okay.
we can put on the table. I think the most important piece is really getting a sense from the board as to what the board's vision here is around, quick versus short, endowment versus not, if endowment, how small or large, because it's all about where do you see, this is kind of a really unique opportunity for us. Where do you see us having the greatest impact? Is it a small number of students, higher dollar amounts, spreading it out more, endowment, yes, no? And we just kind of need to know kind of where the board's at so that the committee can then take it and run and figure out ways to then specifically implement.
Logan, I'm curious to hear your opinion. You want to start?
Sure, yes, endowment question, as Elizabeth indicated, might be a nice one.
Yeah, I think we need to provide direction on one endowment. How long of a period of time do we want to stretch this out? So endowment would be endowment or no? How long of a period? Right? And then I think the other one, which I think I liked, was should we be supporting someone? Is it just a 1 year or supporting someone all the way through their undergrad or potentially through a master's too?
The Disney Fast Pass.
Yes, the Fast Pass. Which those rules have changed, I believe.
Yes, they have. You have to purchase those for quite a lot now.
Yeah, then just did that.
But yes, that captures exactly the kind of guidance that we need.
Okay.
And again, just a little bit more to kind of put a little more color around this. Depending on the schools, you're dealing with vastly different annual tuition. The community college or something in the neighborhood of $6,000 a year. PSU around we're talking all in education costs, not housing and anything else. PSU is about 14,000. Oregon's we're 13, 14, Oregon State's a little bit more, and U of O is a little bit more. And UP is, quite frankly, they're a pretty small player here. We assume only maybe 3 applicants from them. You can't really say the number at UP because it's the private school math, the way they do things. They're constantly, this would reduce scholarships for them. So. But just looking at the main likely recipients, just to give you a benchmark. So a 2,500 is what OSCPA typically grants for merit-based scholarships, their current program. That's not a head-turning scholarship. I would say a neighborhood of a $5,000 scholarship is a head-turning scholarship for an undergraduate. I mean, we have a small number of those at PSU for accounting students, and wow, they really stand out.
That's well said. Okay. And Sherry, you might be able to correct me, with the $2,500 merit-based scholarship, there's already kind of a light applicant pool comparatively.
We don't get as many as we'd like. To Elizabeth's point earlier, it's amazing how people don't take the time to apply for them. But we do, we still give out a lot, over 60 this last year.
Wow, that's fun.
Yeah, and over, I think we were, okay, this is an estimate because it blurs together from year to year, but over $7,000, I think. For 1 year. We're over $2.5 million now since inception.
Wow. That's incredible.
Generosity of members.
Yeah. And that speaks to maybe a higher number making sense to drive applications from students. That might also speak to some flexibility being wise, whereby we could define a range and the OSCPA, depending on applicant numbers, could choose a higher or lower number. That occurs to me. The endowment question, I think, is a nice one to address because it's a simple yes, no. And it's a big question. I kind of tend towards no, Because who knows what the future holds in, 8 years, maybe there will be a glut, maybe, I don't know what's gonna happen in the far future. We're addressing a shortage that exists today. And so I lean towards no endowment, but that's a lightly held opinion. And just like what Joe said, I think the Disney Pass, what is it?
Yeah, you support a student throughout their education,
Yeah.
right?
That sounds very appealing. I think
Yeah,
that students knowing that upcoming support will be there would be a big factor, especially for students that are struggling the most financially.
So this is just a perspective because I currently have a sophomore at Oregon State and I have a freshman at U of O. And scholarships are a full-time job, like to apply for them. As far as my kiddos, their priority for applying for scholarships were either ones that for the most part, they didn't even bother with higher ones. That's what everyone's going to apply for. Their focus was the ones that they could possibly receive multiple years in a row. So like my daughter applied for one that it auto renews for 3 years as long as she meets the academic requirements. She was luckily awarded that one and it was $1,000 each year. So just from a standpoint of kiddos currently going through it, I mean, when, my sophomore applied for, I think 124 scholarships this last year. And she was awarded 5 of them, and it was enough to cover her this entire year for Oregon State. But she prioritized on smaller ones that might be more easily attainable because, they're not $5,000, they're not $8,000. That $1,000 to $3,000, I think, is what kind of grabs students' attention the most. Because you're not filling out 5 pages of applications, but it's more easily attainable because typically with the smaller amounts, there is more to give out. So if you're trying to grab more kiddos applying, that $1,000 to $3,000 range, I think is the most appealing to current students. So just from someone that's living through it. So.
Thank you.
And I would echo that, having just graduated my daughter from Oregon State. And so Sherry, this is something too that maybe we can, there can be some conversation around marketing of this to help students understand how many there are as well when this is marketed.
And also, I was thinking about this too. I mean, we have basically 2 pathways. So right now it's merit-based. So we're adding, for lack of a term, alternative pathway, right? So we would have a needs pathway and we have the merit pathway. I mean, the devil's in the details, but I could see where someone could apply for both.
Absolutely.
Personally, as a bias, I hate to dump all of the money into a few folks. And then we're always gonna have the risk of people not coming in the profession. I'd rather, if I were having a vote, I'd rather see a wide net. And, I guess I would see too, having been around and seeing, the outcome of things, I would hate to see no endowment. And this is all up for the board to decide. I mean, anything I'm saying is only a personal thought, having viewed things, and it's not meant to influence, it's just a sharing perspective.
So I have a general question for Professor Allmer and Logan. Given that these are targeted to a specific field of study and that they're need-based, is there any different way to go about get the application process? Is there a way to make it more automatic for students that are in particular programs? Or, it strikes me as a little different than our merit-based scholarships where you sort of have to affirmatively apply and prove why you should get the scholarship. In this case, it's need-based, so you're proving something, but it's more, the need. And at least it's been a while since I'm actually back in school now, but it didn't go through that process. But the financial aid application process, is there any way we can sort of leverage the processes that are already in place to get a bigger pool of applicants?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Logan.
Oh, yeah, so we do have a accounting scholarship application process where instead of applying to 125 different scholarships, you apply once to all the scholarships,
Got it.
right? And so one thing that occurs to me is we could send you that data
Yeah.
to work with and send you who we give scholarships to. And I think other universities might have a similar process, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is, once the funds get to the OSCPA, we always publicize that, but it is a separate scholarship application process because the funds are not run through our PSU foundation. So if there had been a decision to grant to the individual schools, it would be part of our overall scholarship application process where they're just checking, yes, I'm eligible for all these different scholarships. Since it's going to the OSCPA, we can go the other way and get, I would have to find out about privacy issues. Logan, you'd be in the same position, but about providing communications. Maybe it's that the school provides the communication to a subset of students who meet the requirements based upon our data. So I could easily run a report with accounting majors, Pell Grant eligible, with the GPA requirement. And then I could push something to them specifically and say, you've been identified by the PSU accounting program as potentially eligible for one of these amazing scholarships. Click on this link here. And I will say, I do not think that the current OSCPA application process is overly burdensome. But they typically do require some statement. And so that would have to be, again, on the OSCPA's part with how they work it out. One other thing as to the dollar amount is there's two things going on here that I think need to be remembered. The merit-based scholarships currently are for full-time students only. So one of the things that we felt was very important if we're trying to meet the goals of diversifying the pipeline is that we needed to open up these scholarships to students, even if they're part-time. And so that's another piece of it. And I think that's going to take care of some of this with making these scholarships look more appealing, is that that part-time students are eligible. So sorry, that was a long answer, but we can't just push it directly to them from the
And the devil's
OSCPA.
in the details, I think, one of those things we might see there needs to be that subcategory of who would be the recipient, because if you had, let's just say you have 300 folks apply at the need level, how do you assess who has need more than the next one, right? And then one of the things with talking about the Pell side is this keeps OSCPA Educational Foundation from having to set up a whole nother criteria to determine that financial need when the universities, are already in that mix, and through the Pell process, it's already occurring. So it's not like creating a whole new, set of standards that already exist now, so. I mirror the point that the comment about, echo that point that there's devil in the details, so it's good for us to be working on this far ahead.
And a huge advantage is that every one of this, PCC is not represented on the Ed Foundation, but perhaps they could be going forward. But all the schools have reps on the Ed Foundation, and the lift on that committee is very, it's concentrated, very short lift of just, when they're getting close to granting them. And so I don't think it would be unreasonable to expect a higher level of participation on that committee and ask that liaison from each of the schools in the area to, really be working on very directly between the university or college and the Ed Foundation to ensure that this is really marketed and pushed out to our students. I think there could be a really good process to do that.
I'm in agreement with you, Elizabeth, to just make sure we know.
All right, I just want to let's go around and just hear from the rest of the board members so we can kind of move forward and come up with a direction here. So Logan, we heard from you. Haley, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I could really go either way on the endowment piece. But the direction looks good from a kind of how it's broken out. I definitely strongly support the kind of cradle to grave approach from somebody's educational life.
Wait. Anyone disagree on that piece?
Cradle to grave or?
Cradle to grave, right? Or, yeah, so the fast pass, right? I think everyone, that's unanimous.
I like the fast pass better. Cradle
Yeah.
to grave sounds terrible.
Yeah.
That is not a good marketing tagline to become a CPA.
Well, that sounds like we're supporting them their whole life too.
They're academic cradle to grave.
They're supposed to pay us fees for their whole
So
life.
fast pass approach, I think everyone's clearly on board with, so let's focus on the
That's
other
great.
one. Comment.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on the endowment, I think that there should be one because even when I think through some of the changes that we're making, like 150 to 120, which might make it more attractive, I think like from a diversity angle, I mean, we have struggled with that and will always, I think. So because it's needs-based, I think having that longer would be my feeling about that. Dollar amount? I don't know.
Okay.
Andrew, can you roll up that spreadsheet just a little bit so we can see it all the way to the end? Great, thank you.
I think of the scenarios that we've looked at, this one is my favorite. Both in dollar amount, it has an endowment. And I think this takes them fast pass.
Just a quick note on the note the amounts once the endowment hits. There will be five recipients a year, perhaps, depending on our dollar amounts. And we may maintaining this
And in terms of
fees.
impact and pipeline, it's not really an
So-
impact at all.
And we're
So
paying,
this is,
we're
this
paying
this
management
is,
fees.
oh, sorry. This is one part that I just want to highlight is, we have been having a great deal of discussion on the committee about how we will report this back to the governor's office. And I will tell you that, we're talking about 10 $3,000 scholarships per year. And Martin, how do you think that will play at the governor's office? That we're adding 10 people to the pipeline every year?
I think that it might serve to somewhat diminish the excitement currently being felt by that office. That's a guess, right? I don't know. I haven't had any discussions with them.
Yeah.
I think that what instinctively what I would say is, especially given that I'm talking with policymakers, not CPAs, right? $1 million sounds like, a lot of money. And it will not be intuitive that there is this sudden transition from $1 million to 10 students. I think that's a gap that's not easy to explain in terms of impacts, particularly if you're talking about the workforce pipeline.
Yeah,
issues.
so I wanted you to speak, but I'll have my slightly contrarian point of view is I don't want an endowment. We can disagree. I wanted a full send, like full send, spend it, get as many people as possible, as fast as possible, was my take on it. That's the whole point. It's a pipeline issue. That was the point. Outside of over my dead body, will you sweep this into the general fund?
Yeah.
That was point one. Point two, there's a pipeline issue, but that is my take on it. It's let's make the biggest impact we can as fast as we can.
Yeah.
So that's as simple as I can say, like what my point of view is. And so I just like a full send, let's get as many applicants as we can. And if by people not applying, then maybe we can create flexibility and roll some and do an endowment.
Mhm.
But I just say like, why wouldn't we get as many people in as possible immediately?
Also want to point
So-
out contextually, right? It doesn't change the fact, what I'm about to say doesn't change the fact that right now we can only have a discussion about what's actually requested in the budget. which is the $1 million request inside the budget request for the board, right? But I want to be really clear about two things. One, the legislative piece is ongoing. Now, what that means is there is no ongoing appropriation, but there is a one-time element that will go through the legislature that allows the board on a permanent basis, starting at 0 every budget cycle, to say, is this budget cycle an appropriate time for us to do something in addition to that? So right now, the discussion that we're having is about something that's tied to a very specific time period and a very specific cycle. The legislation will allow us, if so desired by the board, and weighing any financial circumstances we may have down the road, if there is ever a supplement that the board would want to make from its funds to this piece. The second piece, at the risk of stating the obvious, obviously completely outside my authority, right, is that we cannot and do not control what may happen on the private sector side. All I know is that if I was sitting there on the private sector side and I have something like this coming my way, I would want to think about, can we leverage this in some way by some kind of a matching grant and figuring out other ways leveraging, essentially the private sector, not the board, to potentially supplement some of this stuff, which could then also change the character, all of this, right? So I don't have a right to ask this of anyone, but all I'm saying is if you look at the really big picture, right, there's both private sector elements as well as future public sector elements that can further change this picture. Right now, we just can look at the 1 million that we have in the budget request, but it's not the complete picture of what's possible.
Right. Any other comments before we kind of summarize some recommendations? I jumped ahead of you, sorry.
Yeah, so basically with both no endowment or with endowment, we're at the risk of how many students may or may not apply, correct? And
Yes.
so Joey, you mentioned that if we do no endowment, we want to get as many people as possible. With the experience of in the education system, would that allow, or do you think more people would apply if we just put more out, spread it out more scholarships available?
So may I jump in here? The reason I did the calculation on the first sheet and pulled all these numbers from the different universities is I wanted to come up with what do I think the minimum number of applicants would be based upon our experience. And, Tana and I both agreed it was somewhere between 15 and 20%. And realizing too, if we were to present these as multi-year, I think that would help our applications go up. We currently don't have any multi-year accounting scholarships at PSU, and the OSCPA is single year only. So we put in 15% as a really conservative number of applicants that we thought we could get. And again, that's just Pell Grant eligible. There are some students who, there are ways, for example, undocumented students are not eligible for Pell Grants, but we will have, we would like to have the OSCPA include something where a student who's not Pell Grant eligible can demonstrate why they have financial need. So there could, then that population could be bigger than the 513 students that I'm currently estimating. But I think that 80 is a reasonable number of applicants to receive. I hope, based on our past experience and the population of Pell Grant students currently at the schools. That could change in, another year and a half. So I think that 80 is a great starting number.
Right, any other comments or discussion from the board? Gotta try to create some guidance here, so they can move forward. Not hearing any, so let's just try to break it down. We have some kind of division or, what's endowment? Yes or no?
Sounds like I'm the dissenter, so I think majority wins.
Well, we might not be the only one.
I might not have been the only one. I just. Yeah, I just think it's $1 million, not big enough. Not big enough to spend it, that's my opinion, but make an impact. Again, I welcome other views, so. And I hope we can create some sort of excitement and matching in industry to make this bigger and have a much broader impact outside of what we can do and what we can control here. So.
Would be lovely to light a match.
So this isn't a motion type of thing, I don't think. This is just providing guidance, correct? Angie, or just Brian?
Yeah, because it's not, I mean, there's no.
Right, so if we were to kind of say what's kind of the majority here, or what's, as a group, what do we mostly think? Endowment or no?
But should we just do a vote, an unofficial vote?
Is that an okay, appropriate thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on the budget side of it, you would do it, I mean, because you have no, the statute hasn't passed yet, so.
Yeah.
This is just, to me, this is actually not that complicated. It's just a guidance to the pipeline committee
Yeah,
of how you
I-
want to structure this, if it gets approved.
Yeah, so assuming this gets approved, or is the majority saying no endowment?
I would say no.
Okay,
Correct. I agree.
okay. So Elizabeth, the majority at this point in time, if this gets approved, would be no endowment.
Okay, that was what I needed. That simplifies things a great deal.
Okay, thank you. And then we fast passed, we were unanimous on, and I think the other one was kind of how long we want this stretched out, right?
Yeah, and that's really kind of an unknown, quite frankly,
Yeah.
because the first year, we are gonna have a harder time getting the word out. And so over time, we may see more interest. So it's really just about providing us with some sense, if you're not, I almost feel like are we looking at 5 years or 10 years, something like that? We just need to have a sense, even just telling us no endowment is extremely helpful.
Okay.
Because you can back into the number of years too, based upon number of qualified applicants and the amount that you feel you want to give. And again, that amount's lower for a community college too, I would expect.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I was just gonna say, one thing that also might be helpful in analysis is like with the context of the board's previous decisions around the proposals for changing the licensing standards. Does having the 5th year, is that likely to be a requirement, would the board's direction be that if someone did want to pursue a 5th year and go under that licensing option, that they would be eligible for these scholarships, or are we limiting it to basically the essential, which would be the bachelor's degree is like now the minimum requirement if you have 2 years of experience? So that whole question may change the equation part of it.
I would put a plug in on the tax side, even if this does change. Do you all want do you all want to exclude graduate tax education in the state of Oregon? And yes, that's self-serving because PSU has the only one.
But I mean, I don't think this is just a self-serving piece. Ultimately, it's a question of, do we want to micromanage what is the right answer for any given student, regardless of where they're coming from, right? And this profession has a long history of both welcoming folks that kind of knew all along that that's the direction that they wanted to take. And it's also a profession that has a history of accepting career switchers, right? Which basically automatically means a 5th year in order to get there. So I think for us, it's not so much about, preferring one institution over another, but it's a fundamental question of, do you want to pick and choose what the right pathway is, even though the answer to what the right thing is very student specific in what their situation is.
Martin, unless there's something else you can think of, I feel like I have the questions answered that I needed to go back to our committee so we can keep moving forward with our work. Is there anything else you can think of?
No, and since I'm on vacation until October 14th, I look forward to you running many committee meetings in my absence.
I don't think I'm allowed to do that. I will, however, work through you to get this information back to the full committee. So,
Hey, Elizabeth, real quick, and you might know, maybe I should, but on the GPA requirements,
Yeah.
like, are those in line with what the firms would look at?
Okay.
2.7 feels a little light.
It is,
for
it
what
is.
we would
And
look for.
yeah, and actually that highlights something that I don't know that I may be remiss in having not talked to the board about this. Part of what we have said is that it's really hard when you're talking to a high school freshman or a community college student about whether they're ultimately going to become a CPA. We've had a lot of conversation on the board, on our committee about this. And we have kind of come around to the perspective of anything we do to put qualified accountants into the field, whether they are CPAs or they are non-CPAs, is going to alleviate some of the stress. And my argument for that is look at the companies that have been having problems with their internal controls because they don't have enough personnel. And so those aren't necessarily CPAs. Complaints about, the IRS can't hire qualified people because there just aren't enough of them. So we have not said this is solely aimed at trying to, ultimately, we would like, if you look at what we've passed, what you guys agreed to with our, help me out, Martin, the last document that we passed. It doesn't say specifically CPAs. And so that 2.7, that B- GPA, and I always encourage people to think of it as a B-, not a 2, because people, when they key in on the 2, they think a C. I think a B- is a reasonable number. If somebody's getting a B- across the board, they know enough accounting. Are they going to get picked up by a Big 4? No, probably not. Big 4s are remiss to go below a 3.0. So that was, again, a long answer, but this is such a long pipeline. We're trying to, and this is the image I really hope everybody kind of thinks about when you're dealing with diversity in anything. What you're trying to do is get as many people into the top of that funnel. So hopefully you've got more coming out the bottom. And that's been the guiding principle of this committee. And I am, by the way, very pleased that you're supportive of the FastPass, because I think that is really critical to getting them through.
Okay,
So yeah,
thanks
your
for the
point is
context
well
there.
taken.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay,
Appreciate
all right.
the time and,
Thank you
Right.
so much, everyone.
okay. If everyone's okay with it, maybe we can try getting 9C, D, and 10A before we go into executive set. Well, we grab our lunch and then go into executive session to keep moving. Does that work? Like a working executive session lunch?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, we're
Would be great.
falling behind, I feel. So I gotta keep pushing.
Why are you looking at me?
I don't know. Too many questions. What a kid. All right. 9C, Corporate Transparency Act, beneficial ownership, reporting inquiries. So I think, Jeremiah, this probably, I think, is on the agenda for questions you're getting, correct?
Yeah, I'm getting people calling in. Does the board have a position around BOI reporting as it pertains to being unauthorized, unlicensed practice of law?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the bar won't say anything.
So
ASCPA is not saying anything except please don't make us do it yet. And yeah.
Right.
You guys can make a statement.
And I'm curious, are these like firms, because we've talked about it before in a board meeting. Are they looking for us to provide a position where we put something on the website? Are they, I mean, and the fact that the ASCPA hasn't, I don't know why we would be the ones to go out there. and do
People
it.
are calling to find out, am I gonna get in trouble from you guys if I do this?
So they want to do it, but they don't know if they're gonna get slapped by us.
Yeah.
So I think back to like when marijuana just became legal in Oregon, there was a white paper from the board that came out about it, that we weren't going to go after anybody.
Yeah.
I think that's still on.
Yeah, on the aiding and
Yeah.
abetting piece.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was a stretch, in my opinion.
I know, but I'm just saying.
This one's a little more direct because the Corporate Transparency Act is like outside the income tax code. So I don't know why people are doing it. I don't know why CPAs are touching it personally. Adam, what do you think?
Well, I'm on the other side of the same equation, the same argument, but, and I'm not one of the.
It's not worth it.
But I did ask the bar, like in December of last year, and was one of the several CPAs that received a particular like canned response to the bar that basically said they weren't gonna take a position whether it was unauthorized practice of law or not, but you know, and they did say, talk to the Board of Accountancy, but you know, we talked at that point and knew that I mean, it's not the board's, it's not this board's decision whether something is unauthorized practice of law or not. I think the confusion is that the definition of UPL under Oregon statutes refers to CPAs doing things that are outside of the scope of their licensure. And so I think the question is, could the board opine on whether this is within the scope of a CPA's licensure? But I don't know that that's particularly, I don't think that that's necessarily the board's just, you know, position to say that, but because this board wouldn't go after someone for doing it, most likely. The question is it unauthorized practice of law where the bar would go after someone for that, so.
Right.
Yeah. So different than I mean, similar to the marijuana thing, but different in that, like, it's not about whether this board would impose disciplinary.
And what's happening in practice is companies are asking their CPAs to do it. They say, no, go talk to counsel. Counsel say, no, go talk to your CPA.
Yeah. And there's a lot of like firms that have, you know, that are doing that, you know, the like registered agent firms, the like corporate, you know, registration firms, those are the ones that are like doing a lot of it because both the CPAs and attorneys are saying no, but yeah.
So can I just ask, and I'm sorry if I'm like the only one who doesn't know this, but if the issue is that the board essentially is saying, hey, we're not gonna go after someone for the mere fact of making a business decision that they do wanna start providing this service, right? If then you are, you know, licensee A, providing that service, is there a professional standard that applies to that service?
Question.
Just do you care?
Do you care? And if I do this and the law side comes in and says, yeah, we finally made a decision, this is unauthorized practice of law, I think I have an issue with this board.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying we should, I'm just trying to figure this out, right? So it's
not, well, the attorneys, but I would push it back on the bar and say, okay, make a command decision.
Interesting, okay.
And in a recent conversation I had with Benson staff, I mean, they have concerns because the amount of small businesses that basically have completed this, very small in comparison to the 40 million. So.
They've received like 3 million of 40 million reports that they're expecting or something.
3 million they've received and then.
I did tell Sherry though, you have to remember CPAs are really good at waiting until right before the deadline. So for us, even if we were doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it is a concern, you know, a few of the states, I mean, you know, we're talking about this at the society level too. And I mean, it's kind of that same, the majority of the states, it's kind of that same answer of, you know, no member wants to be the test case of, okay, all of a sudden they're going to find that they have, you know, are in violation of the unlicensed practice of law, and they end up going, you know, moves up through the whole thing and then they have an issue. That's what's worrying a lot of members.
Yeah, in all honesty, I wanted to take this off the agenda entirely, but for Jeremiah's sake, and knowing that you're getting calls, we left it on here because it's.
Well, thanks.
So yes, I agree with you, Jason. I don't think it's for us to provide an opinion here. It's just not. And I think for people that are looking to us, they're looking for free legal advice, quite honestly, and it's not our job.
So if someone does do it for somebody and they screwed up for whatever reason, and they lodge a complaint here, and that's the main reason, what do we do?
Then you take it up. Then we have.
Do we take it up?
What would we take it up?
We would have to look at it. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what would, I mean,
You screwed up something that's outside of the scope of.
We have to decide if
Didn't you
it's
just say
do
that we would
care
then-
or if it's not under our jurisdiction.
I think
right?
BOAC would have to decide, does this fall
Yeah.
under the scope of?
Tanya tells me. Tanya will make that determination.
She was okay when everything was headed my way.
She's not planning her timely exit.
Are we, does that, everyone agree with that? I don't think we need motions, but it's not our job to make a position on that.
So, yeah, I'm.
And I apologize,
advising people.
Jeremiah, I wanted, like, I was like, that's what I felt going in, I didn't, it's like,
So then the board's position is that it is not this board's place to have a position.
well, it's not our job, like, that's basically us creating a legal opinion on this, and
I just want something from you guys to point to once.
Effectively, the board would be giving legal advice and we cannot give legal advice.
Okay.
yeah.
I give you legal advice about whether or not you would be giving legal advice.
Right.
Yeah.
Find out some.
You can provide legal advice on whether you'd be, providing or the unauthorized practice of law, so.
That is a core point, calling a professional liability carrier.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what, anytime I'm getting calls that touch issues, we send them, because some of the
Well,
professional liability carriers are having conversations in support
Yeah.
of doing the work, others are not.
I'll be honest that there's a part of me, and this may make you completely cringe, is that I would love to go as far as being even more blunt and say, there is nothing that we have been able to find that would directly entitle you to provide the service just by means of having a CPA license. I mean, I would like to kind of phrase it inversely. It's like, we have not been able to find anything, any authority that would be given just based on you being a CPA to engage in this type of work. We cannot comment on whether it's the unauthorized practice of law, that's not for us, but we don't find an entitlement for you to provide that service just because you're licensed as a CPA.
I think it's just better to tell them to talk to.
Yeah, I would feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would feel.
That goes back to this whole thing again, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just not for this board to
Yeah.
step in, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
So, all right, sorry, Jeremiah, I know
Amanda
that,
has a comment.
oh, go ahead, Amanda.
I think, would it be helpful maybe simply just to clarify that as far as that it's the board's opinion that, or that this wouldn't fall under the practice of public accountancy? Just to kind of define that, would that be a helpful
No.
clarification to be able to point people to something that says it doesn't fall under this definition?
That you're thinking a legal.
Well, the problem there is you don't really know what they're actually going to be doing under this thing, which then makes you kind of comment on an unknown set of specific fact patterns, right? And that's a really uncomfortable position from a regulatory board perspective.
And I have heard that, I mean, you hear, it's very nebulous, but I have heard the flip side of this is under the wheelhouse of CPAs. So,
There's like 3 or 4 states that have actually done like formalities.
Oh,
like
really?
ours-
Saying that
ours
this is
has said
part
that-
of the practice?
Well, said that it's not
Oh,
authorized practice of law, rather. So like that it's not restricted, it's not, yeah.
In that state, it's state by state.
I think I always looked at it just recently as well.
And FinCEN provided some ambiguous guidance. They have frequently asked questions. It says, do I need a CPA or an attorney to do this? No, you can do it yourself. But so they imply that either sets of people might be doing it, but they don't state which person should be doing it. Just say, go ahead and do it. Figure it out.
Yeah. We good? Let's keep moving. All right, 9D, Q2 NASBA CPA exam results data, so.
okay.
Center
I'll
information.
condense my 30-minute topic presentation on this to 30 seconds and simply say there's very rich data for you to enjoy the materials at any time. I welcome questions at any time, including outside board meetings. I will say one data point has come up in my discussions with my colleagues because there's always a lot more close tracking of that data going on whenever you have a change in, you know, the structure of the CPA exam, what are the changes, so on. And what I'm willing to say publicly is that it is clearly out in the public domain now with this data that there appears to be a divergence in terms of the passage rates that you can see on the specialty sections of the CPA exam that has become noticeable. And there's, the furthest I will go in public session is that there's questions that have been raised around the why that might be. So that's a bit on the radar of, you know, some of my colleagues, and I understand that there is some internal follow-up with, you know, the folks that essentially are really close to running the CPA exam structure, as to kind of what some of the underlying reasons for that might be.
Okay. Martin? All right, last one before we take a quick break, 10A, old business. So just update on attendance at the NASBA annual conference coming up next month, October 27th through the 30th. So
We have any last minute interested parties? So far, what we know of and what I think staff has been, so thank you, Marilyn, for taking care of me. I am registered. I know Haley, you are in multiple different hats with some NASBA hatish things going on and board hatish things going on, and us figuring out who's doing what in terms of getting you over there and back. But do we have others? Because we need to act super quickly, because we're like, I think until deadline, and barely, I think tomorrow is the last day. We can register someone without a late fee.
okay, anyone? All right, going once, going twice, gone. Okay, we have Martin and Haley attending. Thank you for representing the Oregon board and / NASBA at the same time. So that takes care of old business. So I'm sorry I pushed it a little long. I think that'll help us get through the rest of the agenda though. So what we'll do is we'll break for a few minutes, give everyone a chance to grab lunch, use restrooms. We'll come back, jump into executive session while we're eating, if that's okay. So I'm now recessing public session and entering executive session under authority of ORS 192-660 sub 2 sub F sub H. The time is now 12:38 p.m.
Okay.